Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. My name is Kurt Smith with Applied Payment Technology, and I'll be serving as your host for today's webinar on an introduction to lifecycle assessment for pavements, Part 1, Fundamentals. This is part of an ongoing series of webinars on sustainability that were developed under the FHWA Sustainable Pavements program and covers all stages of the pavement lifecycle. Before we get started here today, I want to mention just a few housekeeping items. The webinar itself is scheduled for a total of 1 hour and consists of a 50-minute formal presentation and a 10-minute question and answer session. The questions will be answered at the end of the formal presentation, but you may submit your questions at any time during the presentation using the questions box on your control panel. If you don't see the questions box, you may need to click on the orange arrow icon on the control panel to display the settings. At the end of the session, we will work to answer as many of the questions as we can within the time allotted, but because of the volume of questions, we likely will not be able to get through all of them. However, currently plans are being made to organize 2 additional webinar events to address all of the questions that have been raised on all of the past webinar session events. Details on those additional webinars will be made available once the plans are finalized. After the conclusion of the webinar, a copy of the presentation will be shared with all registrants via email, along with a link to the webinar recording once it's processed. You may need to regularly monitor your spam or junk folders, as we found that some of our webinar communication occasionally gets redirected there. Throughout today's webinar, we will be using a number of acronyms referring to different materials, products, and processes. We'll work to introduce these as they are used in the slides throughout the webinar, but this master list will be available in the presentation that we share with everyone later. So now to get things started, I'd like to introduce Monica Gerardo with FHWA, who will preface our webinar with a quick look at FHWA's Sustainable Pavements program. Monica?
Yes, good morning to some of you and good afternoon. My name is Monica Jurado, and I want to thank you for joining us for the Sustainable Pavement Systems webinar series and welcome you to our 9th webinar, an introduction to lifecycle assessment for pavements, Part 1, Fundamentals. Before we get started, I would like to tell you a little bit about the Federal Highway Administration Sustainable Pavements Program. So our program began in 2010 to advance the knowledge and practice of sustainability related to pavements, with the vision and mission to advance the knowledge and practice of designing, constructing, and maintaining more sustainable pavements through stakeholder engagement, education, and the development of guidance and tools, which this webinar series falls under our vision and mission. So, like I mentioned before, this is the 9th out of our series of 10 webinars, and you will receive 1 professional development hour per webinar. And upon the completion of all 8 webinars, 8 out of the 10, you will receive a course completion certificate. Through our Sustainable Pavements program, we also developed the FHWA Sustainability Ambassadors, which is a group of FHWA employees from different disciplines whose goal is to expand the knowledge and outreach within their field that complements the Sustainable Pavements program. And with that, I would like to introduce our speaker for today, who is a Sustainability Ambassador, Ms. Misa Otani, who joined Federal Highway in the Illinois Division Office through the Professional Development Program. Following the PDP program, she served as the Environmental Coordinator for the Arizona Division from 2010 to 2012. And in 2012, Ms. Otani moved to the Hawaii Division as the Environmental Engineer, where she currently manages the environmental program and serves as the area engineer for the Kauai District and the City and County of Honolulu. With that, I'll pass on the microphone to Ms. Misa Otani.
Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon to those of you on the East Coast. I'm Mesa, as Monica said, and so I will be talking about life cycle assessment. So why should you care about LCA? Life cycle assessment is a method to quantify and improve environmental impacts of products, processes, or systems. It's also being introduced at different state highway agencies, such as the Illinois Tollway and the California Department of Transportation. Material producers also use LCA to promote environmental sustainability of products, and future use of LCA is expected to grow significantly. So the way the Illinois Tollway uses LCA tools is to evaluate environmental impacts of materials, equipment, and construction operations, and uses that information in conjunction with life cycle cost analysis and sustainability rating systems in the decision-making process. The California Department of Transportation, or Caltrans, and the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality are also taking steps towards requiring environmental product declarations for pavement and other transportation infrastructure materials for use in reporting, benchmarking, and life cycle assessment for design and asset management, but not yet as part of procurement. So what can you learn from this presentation? What is LCA and what are its possible benefits and uses? How do you conduct LCA as applied to pavements? And what tools and resources are available? So as I mentioned, lifecycle assessment is an environmental assessment tool that is used by several agencies in the world, including the US. This presentation will provide you a short introduction to the current status of the use of LCA in the US and serves as a starting point for agencies and other stakeholders in the pavement industry to learn about the process, key issues, and current applications for LCA for pavement. So again, we're going to talk about what is LCA. This section provides basic information on what it is. So what is LCA? It's a technique to quantify environmental impacts of products and processes. It considers the entire life cycle from raw material production to end of life, and it covers a range of environmental impacts, including resource use, energy, emissions, and waste production. So LCA is a technique, examines material and energy inputs and outputs over the entire life cycle of the product or process. And as I mentioned earlier, life cycle assessment is not the same as life cycle cost analysis. Life cycle assessment quantifies life cycle environmental impacts, and life cycle cost analysis evaluates life cycle economic impacts. So if you tuned into the last couple of webinars, it talked about LCCA. So the benefits of LCCA are going to be further discussed here. So a few examples highlighting the benefits of conducting an LCA to improve pavement sustainability are shown on this slide. So where I talked about LCCA can be used to improve the economic component of sustainability. The environmental aspect, which is LCA, can lead to reduced energy usage, reduced noise, and improved air quality. And then also the social aspect can lead to conservation of natural resources. There is a unique opportunity to improve the sustainability of pavement structures with the potential to deliver tremendous environmental, social, and economic impacts, which, as mentioned in one of the earliest webinar series, is considered the triple bottom line. And with regard to those components, you know, LCA can be used to make informed decisions when you are going through a process. So these are some examples of metrics or priorities or values that may be considered in each individual pavement life cycle stage. So for instance, for materials production, you might consider the manufacturing costs or recycled materials. In construction, you're going to think about worker safety or work zone traffic delay. And at end of life, you're going to think about reuse and recyclability. So how can LCA be used? First, why should you use LCA? It can be used to quantify the current environmental performance, which can be used to benchmark current practices and materials. With those current practices benchmarked, then you can identify opportunities to improve the environmental performance, which can be evaluated, measured, and tracked, to then help inform and guide decision making at a number of levels, which we will talk about in the next few slides. So for project level applications, you can determine your pavement structural and mixture design with the lowest environmental impact, evaluate strategies for preservation, maintenance, and rehabilitation, develop end-of-life recycling strategies, and evaluate material sources and transportation alternatives. As part of a network level application, you can determine environmental impacts of various pavement management strategies, develop targets for environmental goals, optimize investment decision making, and integrate LCA indicators into agency transportation asset management plans, also known as TAMPs. And then on the policy level, it can guide development of specifications and policies affecting pavement durability, such as changes in your specified compaction levels for asphalt pavements, or the use of supplementary cementitious materials in concrete pavements. So what's important to know? The results from different LCAs should not be compared because they are context sensitive. Since LCAs perform to address a specific question for a specific product or process that provides a specific function in a specific geographical location. So all of that just to say no two results from LCA studies should be compared. And LCA is also just one indicator in the decision-making process. You have to consider other key factors such as life cycle agency costs, work zone safety, user costs, etc., in determining how you make your decisions as an agency. So what are the steps in the pavement lifecycle assessment process? There are 4 basic steps to the LCA process, which are defined in the International Organization for Standardization 14040 or ISO, which is step 1 is the goal and scope definition. Step 2 is an inventory analysis. Step 3 is the impact assessment, and step 4 is interpretation. All right, so for the first phase of an LCA, determines key features of the analysis, including the depth and breadth of an LCA, which can differ considerably depending on the overall goal. The scope of an LCA defines the system boundary of analysis. So basically what life cycle stages and processes are included in the LCA, the geographic and temporal boundaries of analysis, the functional unit of analysis, and also determines the required quality of data. Again, all of these depend on the subject and the intended use of the LCA. As an example, an agency may have the following LCA goal: to determine the environmental impacts of a pavement structural design. With that goal established, the scope needs to be defined with a partial list of some of the items to consider in developing the scope listed. Which life cycle phases are we going to include in this study? Is it going to be a cradle to gate study, or will this be a cradle to grave study? Are there some pavement life cycle stages that will be excluded? Will the LCA undergo a critical review? What are the system boundaries? What are the allocation rules being considered? And how is uncertainty being handled? The key decisions made from this assessment are typically documented in a goal and scope document for the LCA being performed. So as you can see on this slide, LCA's plot is similar to the life cycle cost analysis, where along the y-axis we would look at agency user costs, and for LCA we are looking at environmental impacts. So this is just a brief example of different activities to consider, such as initial pavement construction, or if you're going to do asphalt overlay or chip seal, and then the end of life removal of that product. So step 2 in the LCA is to perform the life cycle inventory assessment. So you track all the inputs and outputs from the system. These are inputs of resources and outputs of waste, emissions, and co-products are estimated for each activity to produce this life cycle inventory assessment. Resource flows considered are energy and materials, whereas emission flows are emissions to air, land, and water. So step 3 of the LCA is to translate resource and emission flows from step 2 into environmental and health indicators. The resource and input and output flows, which can range from narrowly focusing on energy and greenhouse gas emissions to a broader set of impact categories, are translated into selected impact category results. The most commonly used impact categories in the US are based on the Tracy tool, or the tool for reduction and assessment of chemical and other environmental impacts. This is a tool developed by the US Environmental Protection Agency. And on the next slide, we'll talk about the impact assessment categories. So as I stated, Tracy is an environmental impact assessment tool developed by US EPA. It provides characterization factors for life cycle impact assessment, industrial ecology, and sustainability metrics. Characterization factors quantify the potential impacts that inputs and releases have on specific impact categories in common equivalence units. So as you can see, the categories are ozone depletion, climate change, acidification, eutrophication, smog formation, human health impacts, and ecotoxicity. So as the final step for an LCA, the overall results are summarized and recommendations are developed for decision-making in accordance with the goal and scope definition. A review as part of steps 1 and 4 of the LCA process by a carefully chosen group of experts or stakeholders is recommended to ensure that the assessment meets the standards as claimed. So as part of this step, you'd identify your limitations, evaluate completeness of inventory and assessment, perform the critical review by a carefully chosen group of experts and stakeholders, and then summarize the results and develop recommendations for decision making. So what is the agency's role in conducting pavement lifecycle assessment? The different agency responsibilities include developing project delivery workflow, determining department or personnel in charge of LCA, identifying decision points for LCA use, determining data needs and data quality requirements, determining who will perform the LCA, and then identifying reviewers and decision makers. An agency needs to be actively engaged in the LCA process to ensure that it is relevant to the agency. So what are the resources required for an agency to use LCA? Resources needed vary with the use of how the agency is going to use LCA, but they typically rely on the use of LCA expertise from dedicated internal staff or hired experts. There are a number of commercially available LCA software tools and also spreadsheet-based tools that include lifecycle inventory data sets for pavement that can be used as a starting point to develop LCA models. And some state highway agencies have developed their own customized LCA software tools with agency-specific default background data. So some agency-specific data that you would need include the analysis period, the timing performance, and material quantities for each activity, mixed designs, current and projected traffic volumes, construction work zone inputs, construction site equipment usage, such as hours, fuel, and electricity, construction waste treatment, transportation modes and distances involved along with fuel usage information, such as materials hauling and construction. And then industry data. You need a background data sets for materials, plant operations data, emission factors for categories of vehicles using the pavement, environmental factors for construction equipment, or emission factors for construction equipment, and also environmental product declarations. LCA is a very data intensive process, so that's also something that everyone should be aware of, and attention must be paid to data sources and data quality, because basically if you're going to put something that's not quality data in, you're not going to get quality data out. So what are some tools available to conduct LCA? There are several tools available, each with a unique goal or purpose. And there's not a universal tool or industry standard. So some examples include the Illinois Tollway tool, the Athena Pavement LCA tool, the Project Emissions Estimator, Green Dot, Open LCA, and then also the Federal Highway Infrastructure Carbon Estimator, which is going to be presented in a webinar hopefully this summer. So look out for updates on that. And then also the Federal Highway Pavement LCA tool, which is currently being developed in accordance with the Pavement LCA framework that was prepared in 2016. And FHWA's Pavement LCA tool is being developed with input from state highway agencies with the pavement industry. In addition, a dedicated group of potential users from state highway agencies, which is the Pavement Lifecycle Thinking Task Group, are also guiding the development of the tool. This group is closely involved in all stages of the development of the tool, and it will make use of public and open source data sets. So talking about some of the other tools, the Illinois Tollway tool includes pavement, structures, drainage, lighting, and landscaping. The PE tool includes greenhouse gas emissions models for construction, maintenance, and use. And Green Dot from AASHTO performs a high-level carbon dioxide calculation from the operations, construction, and maintenance activities of state highway agencies. And then Open LCA is an open source LCA tool. It is being used by the Federal LCA Commons, which you can find out more about at www.lcacommons.gov. So where can I find more information? And I think I turn it back over to Monica.
Yes. So some of the products that we have in regards to with the Sustainable Pavements program include our Towards Sustainable reference document. We also have a LCA framework document, and all this information can be found in our website, which also includes some webinars, technical briefs that we have, such as technical briefs in pavement sustainability, life cycle assessment, and others in improving resiliency of pavements, and the most important, or what we call one of our most important documents, is a Sustainable Pavements Program Roadmap. On the next slide, you'll be able to see the links to the recorded webinars, which you have been receiving through emails if you participated or requested registered for the webinar. And we would like to invite you to our last webinar, webinar number 10, which is LCA Part 2, which is focused on EPDs and PCRs. EPDs are Environmental Product Declarations, and PCRs are Product Category Rules, and that will be July 23rd. If you haven't signed up for it, please do so. And we are adding 2 more webinars. We're still in the scheduling process and it will be webinar 11 and 12, and it will focus on all the questions and answers that we did not get to answer throughout the webinar series for all webinars 1 through 10. And so we'll have those available too for you to register. And with that, if you have any questions, please feel free to contact Heather Dilla or myself. And also feel free to visit our Sustainable Pavements website at any time. And with that, I'll hand it over back to Kurt for questions and answers.
All right, thank you, Monica, and thank you, Misa. We appreciate that overview. Again, remember that this is the first part of a 2-part presentation on LCA, so we'll be following up again in a month on the second part. So this presentation was intended to kind of be an overview and kind of give everyone a flavor for what's involved with LCA. We've been receiving a few questions, but I would encourage everyone to submit additional questions. If anything came up as we were going through the presentation material, feel free to use the question box and submit some additional questions. Maybe just to get things started, we've got a couple here. Misa, I'll direct this to you. Question is, what are the most common environmental impact indicators and which ones are considered to be the most important?
I think I'll turn that over to Heather.
Okay.
Sure, that's fine. And with regards to the impact indicators from the federal highway standpoint, we don't give any technical guidance on which is the most important. So I just wanted to clarify that. That's really left to the states. But from what we are seeing as far as trends in the states that are either showing interest in LCA or have regulations that they're using LCA to help meet the current state regs, it is usually focused on the greenhouse gas or climate change impact category or energy use. Those two are the ones that tend to be commonly used. And it's the best practices to include all the impact categories. Tracy has numerous impact categories that Misa went over, such as acidification, eutrophication, smog, ozone depletion, etc. Because there could be trade-offs amongst them. And so if you do just focus on one indicator, you could be missing some of the trade-offs in the other indicators and not getting the whole picture. And in addition, when you do focus on just climate change, it would actually be considered more of carbon footprinting rather than LCA. LCA really is encouraging looking at all the different indicators, potential indicators.
All right, thank you, Heather. And I think Heather made an important point that it really depends on the agency or the user in terms of what may be most critical for them, depending on whether they have certain goals that they're trying to achieve may dictate which of those different indicators might be the ones that they would be giving most weight to. Let's move on to another question, and I think I'll direct this one to Heather as well. Heather, the question is, what is FHWA's view of product LCI/LCA information from industry associations, for example, Asphalt Institute or Eurobitume?
That's a good question. There was a slide that mentioned many various tools, and there are various tools out there, and many of them have different data sources. And I think what's unique to the tool that is being created under FHWA is we are really trying to work with industry on what would be the best data that represents their industry, but then we're also trying to encourage harmonization amongst the industries in what would be considered some of the background data sets that they use and or common background data sets such as electricity usage, etc. So we recognize that there is not harmonization in the approaches that's being used for these studies, but we're trying to encourage harmonization, and we certainly want to work with industry on getting what is the best data into that tool. So some of those conversations, particularly to what was mentioned here, Asphalt Institute data or Eurobitume, the commercial databases, we're going to be having those discussions. With regards to commercial databases, we believe it should be more, the data in the tool should be public data, so freely available that anyone could access. And so therefore, we're not putting in commercial databases per se, but if, the data is in the federal commons, Misa mentioned the federal commons, it's where all the US federal government data or some of the industry data that is provided to the LCI database is being published. So we would be largely encouraging industry to publish their data in the commons and then easily incorporating into the tool, or work with industry to get it up in the commons, etc., to make it more available and easily implemented it into some of the frameworks and ongoing efforts we have. So that, I think, pretty much covers it. With regards to some of the reliability and certainty of this data. You know, right now we're just trying to encourage the industry and the federal government as well to come together and get better data sets. Once we get better data sets, I think certainly we want to get more of the statistical data that's involved with some of this, if possible as well, so that you could do more probabilistic studies in the future on the LCA. But right now, I do recognize that most of the studies which wasn't mentioned today in environmental product declarations, that's another potential data source. They are just a deterministic value versus value with some of an average with some standard deviation.
All right. Thank you, Heather. Let's go back to Misa. Misa, there was a question about federal LCA Commons, and maybe you could talk a little bit more exactly what that is.
Hi, sorry, I was on mute. The federal LCA Commons is a community of practice of LCA practitioners working within and for the federal government to align and advance LCA research. It also maintains a repository dedicated to access to and long-term preservation of federal LCA data, tools, and resources. Heather, aren't you on the LCA Commons, or you were part of it at one point?
Yes, so FHWA is a member of the federal LCA Commons, along with Department of Defense, USDA, EPA, the national labs, so Argonne, who is largely responsible for the GREET models, as well as NRAIL and many others, or NIST is involved. And so we're all trying to find synergies amongst our efforts and harmonize our approaches. And so one of the synergies that we found is we at FHWA with this group is we feel that there's a strong need for some common background data sets to help create EPDs that potentially could be used for public procurement. And so to do that, we're organizing the group to put together a roadmap towards background data sets, these common background data sets. There's been major efforts made towards a common electricity background data set that should be loaded on the repository soon, but we definitely need to tackle transportation, and that's where I think one of the previous questions as far as Asphalt Institute and the petroleum industry related to asphalt, there's a little bit of overlap, and we'll have to work together in how we're going to harmonize that, the transportation flow and then the byproduct being asphalt from that stream.
All right, great. Thank you, Heather. Heather, as long as you're on the line here, let's shoot another question your way. The question is, in doing a life cycle assessment, should you take into account a residual value when the service life extends beyond your analysis period, similar to kind of what's done on a life cycle cost analysis?
Say that again one more time. It helps when I'm reading them while you say them, but I didn't catch where this one is on my list.
So the question is, like in life cycle cost analysis, where your service life of one of your rehab treatments, for example, exceeds beyond your analysis period, you have a residual value that you account for that impact. Is a similar type of factor needed in doing a life cycle assessment?
Yeah, so in the life cycle assessment, you need to ensure that you have a functional unit, and that the functional unit, if you're doing an attributional life cycle assessment where you're comparing one product to the other, the functional unit needs to be the same. And so service life is usually part of that functional unit. And then you're absolutely correct. If one has a longer service life than the other option, there are techniques that you can do to account for that so that you are comparing apples to apples. And the LCA framework does give you some of those options. So if you do access the website and look at the Federal Highways Life Cycle Assessment Framework for Pavements, it goes into some of the more details and strategies on how you would account for that.
Great, thank you. Let's go back to Misa. Misa, there's a question. Other than Illinois Tollway and Caltrans, are there any highway agencies or other transportation agencies actively using life cycle assessment in their decision-making process?
So I believe that the Arizona Department of Transportation has started using life cycle assessment, but Heather might know more about what other states are doing. I'm not too sure. I know Hawaii is not, but there might be other states doing that.
Yes, Misa, you're correct. Arizona State has shown interest. They haven't necessarily used LCA in their decision making, but they're definitely showing interest in learning how LCA could be informative and used. And so I feel that they are one of our key champions. There are certainly other states that are being proactive in trying to figure out how LCA would be used at their agencies, largely trying to get ahead of current or proposed legislations that may be introduced in their states. And so some of those states that have had recent legislations introduced or suspecting that some would or could be introduced would be Minnesota, Washington, Oregon, all have had some proposed legislation at the state level and in various drafts and versions. So they have been states that we've been working with. In addition, there's been some recent, I know in Oregon, there is some recent, I think it's an executive order and push to reduce greenhouse gases. So I think Oregon DOT may be looking at LCA more from a programmatic approach on where are their hot spots where they could look at reducing their greenhouse gas footprints, maybe not specifically get to this design level, but due to that executive order, I know that there's some interest there. As well as, what was some of the other states? I think I've seen similar type benchmark surveys out of Illinois. Sometimes the states may contract with a university to do some of these studies. So I think Illinois was contracted out to a university, but it was, again, more of where are the most of the embedded emissions, embodied emissions coming from in their purchasing. So again, at the high level type benchmarking, not in the pavement design aspects.
All right, thanks, Heather. And jumping over now on the topic of tools, there are several tools that were highlighted. There are just some general questions about the applicability of some of these tools. Are they limited to use just in the US? Do they have international applicability? Maybe I'll throw that one to Heather.
Sure. All the tools are made with different purposes, and you should always be aware of what went into the tool and what is some of the background data and what is the goal and scope of how that tool was made for. And so, like I said, the FHWA tool is made specifically, the default data would be more geared towards the US, since it is for being made by the federal highways from the US. So it wouldn't be necessarily made that would be applicable to other countries in the international sphere. But that doesn't mean that a lot of the framework that has been developed, especially a lot of the work that is being developed through the Federal Commons, they're mapping out how the LCA should be done, couldn't be easily adapted for international purposes. So there are two efforts going on at FHWA, and the LCA tool that was referenced by Misa that is going to be out in September is an Excel-based tool very similar to Real Cost And the one thing about that tool, you can add EPDs into it easily, and so you would be able to customize that tool to be used at an international level. However, what I meant is the default data right now is geared towards the US. So it would be you would have to do a little bit of work to take it and use. I'm not aware of any global pavement LCA tool that is applicable to all nations. I am aware of European tools. In France, they have one called Civ. Netherlands has one called Dualboekhout. I think even there may be some in Sweden being developed, as well as Spain. So definitely Europe has done a lot of activity in pavement LCA. But with the second version of the tool that FHWA is working on, with Open LCA, we plan to map out all the unit processes that would go into an LCA and upload that framework in Open LCA platform. So it's like taking that manual, the LCA framework that I referenced earlier, and actually digitally putting it all together into a LCA software platform. That would be probably something that is the closest to a global tool. And all you would have to do is update the data sets, but to the specific country. But it would have all the underlying framework mapped out in unit processes that is required. So it should be the easiest to update, but that's more to support future efforts in this program area. It's more advanced, and hopefully in the future, we could take the interface that's in the Excel tool and merge it with the Open LCA platform and all that framework that we're being developed.
Okay, thanks, Heather. And coming back to you again, still on the topic of tools, that seems to be a very popular issue right now. First of all, there's a question whether you could provide a few more details about the FHWA Pavement LCA tool, maybe what it includes and whether or not it's an open source software.
So the Pavement LCA tool that we are creating in Excel, as I mentioned, is not open source. Because we can't create software unless we go through the special procedures. So we're just taking Excel and creating an interface to help facilitate with the calculations. Similarly, the other effort that I mentioned where we're mapping out the framework in Open LCA. Open LCA is an open source software, and there is a journal paper that's going to be published, hopefully in the near future, if it's not already, that explains the language, the underlying language to support further open source, the API for that particular effort. So it is the closest thing to the an open source nature, and that could be taken and made in that platform. But again, we're using Open LCA, which is open source, and using that software to create the framework and added in the API that would be needed for Pavement LCA.
All right, and one more follow-up just on LCA tools. Are any of the currently available LCA tools capable of handling the use phase impacts?
The one that I'm aware of that is available with the use phase is the Athena Pavement LCA tool. As far as FHWA's stance on this is, we are currently have an effort that is looking at the use phase, and particularly pavement vehicle interaction. And so we're trying to take this in a phased approach. So we're starting with a simple, it's cradle to grave in the fact that you can model the maintenance activities and the end of life activities in this LCA tool. However, we're not looking at the use phase as it pertains to urban heat island issues, as it pertains to stormwater runoff issues, or your vehicle emissions, vehicle pavement vehicle interaction and vehicle costs, vehicle operating costs. So we're not looking at that yet. And in the next phases of the tool and updates, that's something we would like to incorporate in the future. But as I mentioned, we have another effort that is particularly looking at all the different models for pavement vehicle interaction and how easy and feasible are they to incorporate into LCA or LCCA in that matter to make decisions. And I don't think we're quite there yet on what models we would recommend. So that's where we stand there.
All right, great. Thank you, Heather. Let's go back to Misa. And Misa, there is a question of whether LCA can be applied to assess the environmental impact of different materials technologies. For example, the use of a recycled material versus the use of virgin materials in say an asphalt mixture.
Yeah, I believe that would be as part of the initial inputs for the raw materials, that you would consider what the different inputs and outputs are from that individual material, and that would also be part of your probably your pavement design. And then to manage the lack of field performance data, I mean, you'd have to, that's probably one of the issues with you know, adopting it for a specific agency or program, is that the LCA needs to be tailored specifically to that agency and what the different parameters are. So if there's no data, that's where the data collection would have to come in, and you need to obtain quality data in order to get a quality LCA. But that's as far as my understanding. Maybe somebody else has a better answer.
Anything to add to that, Heather?
I think you're good. Yeah, you want, as far as performance life, you'd want to know what you're comparing and use, if it's, you know, repavement management systems, you could put this up in parallel to how you would conduct your LCCA. And so a lot of the inputs for your life cycle cost analysis would be similar, other than how much materials are you using? That's a little bit different.
All right. Another question, I think I'll pose this one to Heather. Heather, the question is, what precautions must be taken if the majority of the data available for an LCA is secondary in nature?
So when you're using secondary data, that means you're using it, a lot of the inputs in the data is coming from some other source that may not be specific to what you're using. So you need to be sure on the interpretation of your results are in line with the data sources that you have. And what I mean by that is, if you're making a decision between mixed design compared to another mixed design, you want to be sure that the differences in the actual results are coming from the differences in the mixed design and not from these background data sets potentially. So they should be in harmony. So what data you need for the study should be in line with your goal and scope. And there may be a situation where you just don't have the data to use LCA to determine what you want in the end. And it is an iterative process, but there is statistical analysis that you can do. And as I mentioned, you know, we want to push to get more statistical information and good metadata and data quality on the background data sources, so we can use the statistical information in our LCA studies and do more of a probabilistic analysis, as we would recommend with life cycle cost analysis. So I think it's an evolution, you know, as we start looking at deploying LCA. It's going to take some time.
All right, thank you. Let's jump back to Misa. Misa, the question about whether life cycle cost analysis and life cycle assessment should be used together. Is the goal to use those together as part of the decision-making process?
I think that would be up to what your priorities are in terms of, benefits and cost of the different tools. So if you're considering, more of your environmental impact versus more of your monetary impact, then that's where you would weigh those options of what you're going to consider. But there are, that's up to the independent agency to make that decision on what they value, what they value the most out of those different measurements.
All right, and thanks. And kind of as a follow-up to that, there's a question of what is FHWA's perspective on LCA and how it would be used by an agency currently? Is it intended just kind of as a informational tool, or is FHWA looking eventually for it to be used as part of the procurement process?
So
Oh, go ahead, Heather.
Yeah, I can answer that one, Misa. I was going to chime in. I didn't realize he didn't direct it to anyone else. So what we are recommending at FHWA is we're looking at LCA right now and trying to get state DOTs engaged and in understanding the LCA process. And so we're focusing primarily on education and outreach, largely because we're seeing that legislation is coming down, and we would like agencies to be aware of what LCA is prior to them being forced to have to do LCAs for every pavement design. In addition, though, I do see that the future of LCA would be to use it for decision making, and it could be used in many different ways. And we have a paper that goes into LCA and how it can be used in your state transportation plans, to the NEPA analysis, and how it can later on be used in the bidding and then as built, and how you need to create feedback loops to transfer this data so that we're constantly informing all of those decision-making processes. So that's the end goal. And so if you are signed up to our newsletters, which I'm assuming most of you guys are, if you aren't, I would encourage you to go on the website and become a friend. You'll get references to when that article is published, and so that you could read and take a look of how we see the future of LCA is in transportation and its decision making. But right now we're focused primarily on the education, building up the data. I think if you can build up and get good solid data, core background data sets that support industry EPDs, strong industry averages that can feed in to these LCAs, then we can use LCAs in bidding or many different other applications.
All right, thank you. I'll direct this one to Misa. Misa, that's a question about whether specific pavement techniques or treatments can be evaluated using LCA. And the specific example that the questioner raises is something like mechanical stabilization using, say, geosynthetics. Is something like that capable of being modeled or considered in a life cycle assessment?
I believe so. I think it considers the pavement design. So if you have, instead of an 8-inch base and then 4-inch overlay or asphalt thickness, then if instead you have something like Tensar or whatever as part of your base stabilization, I think you would look at the different aggregate production, and then also what's the production for that mechanical stabilization tool that you're using. So that's where you would have to compare the different pavement designs that you can use.
Right, and then be able to document the various environmental impacts associated with each of the different approaches.
Yeah, and that's probably where also like the life cycle cost analysis and stuff comes in, and that's the considerations that you would be looking at.
Right. All right, thank you. Heather, I'll turn this next one to you. The question is, if an agency wants to use a multi-attributed LCA indicator, has anyone estimated the relative weights of some of the different indicators?
You know, we don't have any recommended weightings as far as the federal LCA Commons and work that we're doing. And I've heard that that was one of the needs or wants and desires of the federal LCA government, but heard that there may be some challenges in doing so. So I don't have anything to recommend. I do know that at least in the past, there have been some weights included in some of the tools out of NIST that has in their birds and bees models that looked at it. And I think they used other scientific weightings that had been done in the past, but they've never been updated for quite some time. So it is something that the federal LCA Commons did discuss in our recent meetings, but I don't know if it's where we would be focusing at this point in time per se, and we would be leaving it mostly up to the states to come up with their recommended weightings.
All right, thanks. And then I think we're down to just one final question. And Heather, I think you kind of touched on this already, but if an agency is interested in starting to get into this, where does an agency go to start getting data? Does FHWA have a database that may be available for use?
So in our LCA tool, some data will be uploaded in there. And then the agency, if they wanted to, they could start requesting EPDs, and they could potentially put EPDs up in there and start building even more data sets. But with regards to how to do that, I would really strongly encourage the agency to reach out to FHWA or Monica Geraldo, who's putting on this webinar series. And they can set up workshops to help the agency get started. We do have some one-pagers on the website, one's particularly for data and what are the data needs, because it is quite a data-intensive process. And as I mentioned, we are working in creating that roadmap for federal background data sets to start building up some common background data sets for the future. But it is not an easy one-stop to shop of where you can go to get this data at this point in time. And we're hoping to provide the tools that can meet that need.
Great. Thank you, Heather. And we've reached a milestone here. We got through all of the list of questions. So we appreciate everyone raising those questions and giving us the opportunity to respond to those. So we'll just go ahead and close things out here. So again, I want to thank everyone for your time and attention, and I hope you found the webinar informative. We welcome you to our next 10th and final presentation in this webinar series, which is scheduled for July 23rd, and we'll present part 2 of this session on pavement life cycle assessment. So thanks again, and so long, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms.